Hi, welcome back, everyone, to the DGS Presents YouTube channel. Brought to you by the Dead Game Society. We play with dead things, and we talk about it. So today is just a really quick check-in. I wanted to talk about a couple things within the realm of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which we talk about quite frequently, but not just Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. But a couple things I was thinking about, and then one thing that needed to be clarified. But the first thing I want to talk about was there is this kind of trope that got entered into Dungeons and Dragons. I think maybe it was from the Tolkien books, certainly from the Lord of the Rings movies. This idea that an adventuring party, no matter how big it is, and no matter how far they have to go, they always walk, regardless of the terrain. So, you're packing up your backpacks and your gear and your spell components and your weapons and your provisions and everything. And then it's just going to be which just isn't realistic, because medieval boots, shoes, they're not going to withstand 200 miles of wilderness travel, right? Like swamps and bogs and fields and prairies. They're going to get torn to shreds. They're going to disintegrate. You're going to move at a snail's pace through the countryside, and it's going to be exhausting, right? So that's just not how people traveled in the Middle Ages, right? Normally people would keep to roads, paths, trails, and they would go on horseback. If we remember from the rules, right, a PC with a movement rate of 120 can march about 24 miles in one day. And then if you're wearing heavier armor, like, chainmail or heavier than chain, like plate mail or something, your movement rate is going to be restricted further, right? You're going to move 90 normally. But a horse, right, can move, a standard horse can move like 48 miles per day, depending on the terrain. And if we look at the horses in the monster manual, right, there's a few different ones. There's like a draft, a heavy, a light, a medium. There could be a pony, right? And purchase a horse, and then you get enhanced movement. You can get to your locations much faster, and you can carry a lot more gear. Now, or that's another option. But if you can also get a vehicle of some kind, and this is from the Wilderness Adventurer's Guide in Dungeons and Dragons. And here they present us with things like carts pulled by mules or ponies or chariots or wagons. You can also get a carriage, although I don't see it listed here. I'm sure there's stats somewhere for a carriage. And I do remember that in Dungeon Module I-10, which is Ravenloft 2, the house on Griffin Hill, one of the PCs, I think the pre-rolled characters had a carriage. I think the magic user, or maybe it was one of the characters inside the actual module, but a big elaborate carriage that could carry all kinds of things. There's like a trunk in the back where you can put things. That's great. I mean, a carriage is, a great way to travel. So, keep in mind that, you're just not going to be walking across the countryside normally, unless you're just going a couple miles. If it's an expedition, you're really going to have to, figure out some means of transport that's going to involve horses or camels or mules or ponies. And then you look like a proper adventuring party at that point. So the other thing I want to talk about today, and this gets a little bit into the nitty gritty, but is initiative in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I know this has been done to death, and this is something that people have talked about, people have argued about, and I know that some of the audience even, we're arguing about this. So what I wanted to do today is I just wanted to make a few points on initiative, and I wanted to point to certain sections in the books about how initiative actually works in AD&D, and there are some contradictions here, and I will point them out. So the first thing that we have to remember in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is that the 1 minute combat round, right, which is divided into the 10 segments, right, 6-second segments. Everything happens within that 10 segment point span of time, right? Everything happens in there. It's not a case where you roll initiative, one side gets to go for a full round, then side B gets to go for a round. It's kind of back for. It's not like that. It's everything is happening within this span of time, and we have to figure out. And this is my point. You have to figure out when, within terms of segments, you get to act within that 10-minute framework. So one thing that people say is they say, okay, spellcasters, right, always they start casting spells on segment 1. Well, that's nowhere in the book, all right, and we're going to see that that's actually not the case. Or it doesn't matter what kind of weapon you're using. If you win initiative, you always go first, and segments don't matter. Or segments only matter in terms of spell casting. That's not the case either. So if we look at this document that I put up here, I'm just making some general points about initiative and how it works. Point 1, segments are not simply used to determine casting time or to break initiative roll ties between melee combatants or spellcasters. Segments do the following. In Player's Handbook, page 40, it says, in combat, the turn is divided into 10 melee rounds. Rounds are subdivided into 10 segments for purposes of determining initiative and order of attacks. Okay, so we see here that segments are used to determine order of attacks. It's not simply for spellcasting. So we have to know when you can swing that longsword or that battle. Kinky. Now, part 2 here. Segments tell us the required time it takes to cast a spell, but the text does not say that all spells begin to cast from segment 1. All right, so Player's Handbook, page 44. Rods typically take 5 segments to activate. Staves take 2 segments. And wands usually take about 3 segments to activate. Now, in the text, casting time shows the number of melee rounds or segments of a melee round required to cast the spell. And remember, there's 10 segments to a melee round. Some spells require additional time and preparation. Nowhere does it say there that you start casting on segment 1. It simply says that in order, for instance, to cast Fireball, you need 3 segments. This brings us to the next point, point 3. According to the rules, the side which wins initiative always acts first. Now, so if we look down in this little text here, it says the initiative will always go to the non-slowed or hasted side. In most cases, the group with the higher die score will always act first. All right. Keep that in mind because we're going to come back to it in a minute. Part 4 here, let me flip the page. We get into 4. Attacks or spells will begin on the segment indicated on the losing side's D6 initiative roll. This is in the DMG, page 65, and it's also in the Osric reference on 120. This comes from this section here. You see those numbered things. This has to do with spellcasting and combat. Number 2 here says, attacks directed at spellcasters will come on that segment of the round shown on the opponent's or on their own initiative side die, whichever is applicable. Let me rephrase that. Attacks directed at spellcasters will come on that segment of the round shown on the opponent's or on their own side's initiative die, whichever is applicable. Right. What? Osric took this to mean, and I take this to mean, that if side A, for instance, rolls on the D6 for initiative and rolls a 5, and side B rolls a 3 and loses initiative, side A will go on segment 3. So if you cast a fireball and you're part of side A, you would basically cast it in on the 6th segment, it would go off. Now, many people have argued with me about this, but that's been a tradition for some time now to play it that way. It appears on a lot of forums. It's an implied rule. I'm going to talk about why it's implied in a minute. It has to do with the mathematics of how this whole thing works. So moving on, let's get down here to point 5. And again, I'll upload this to the show notes. Point 5, weapon speed can determine who acts first, right? Or, attacks first in a combat round. Simple, right? DMG, page 66. Point 6, weapon speed can also determine who attacks first when attacking an opponent, and here's the text, it's very interesting here, engaged in an activity other than striking blows. It doesn't say attacking a spellcaster. It says attacking anybody engaged in an activity other than striking blows. I mean, they could be singing. They could be fleeing. I don't know what they're doing, but they're not involved with exchanging blows.
You're gay for saying that.
Yeah. So that is still pretty straightforward, but then it gets to point 7 here, and here's where we run into trouble. According to the DMG, this is where things get wonky. This is on page 66. When an attacker is trying to strike a spellcaster, we must compare the number of segments necessary to cast the spell versus the weapon speed. We subtract the losing initiative die from the weapon speed to see if the weapon hits first. So the example here is a sword with a speed factor of 5. Let's say it's a long sword, is being used by an opponent of a magic user attempting to cast a fireball spell, which takes 3 segments. If the sword-wielding attacker was represented by a losing initiative die roll of 1, the spell will be cast prior to the sword's blow. A 2 will indicate that they go off at the same time, and a 3 to 5 on the losing side will indicate that the blow has a chance of striking before the spell goes off. Now, what are the problems with this? Let's scroll down a little bit here. The problems with this is if we use this rule as written, it's going to result in melee or missile attacks almost always getting an attack in on a spellcaster before the spell goes off, even if the former loses the initiative roll. So if you look at the screen here, I have an example here. Let's say a thief is attacking a magic user with a dagger. That dagger speed, right, speed 2. If we look at the initiative roll on the D6 and compare this against the 3-segment casting time of the fireball in this table, an attacker with a dagger pretty much always attacks first or at worst simultaneously. So the wizard has no chance to get the spell off. So if a thief can just jump in front of him and get into that 10-foot encounter space, and the magic user is trying to cast a spell that takes, let's say, more than 2 or 3 segments to cast, or even 3, he's just not going to get the spell off. He's going to get stabbed. Now, a longsword, as we saw in the previous example, will attack first when rolling a 3 to 5 on the losing initiative. So that's a problem. Okay, it totally nerfs the spellcaster. It makes casting spells in combat like almost impossible if you're getting ambushed. And yeah, it's going to make fighters a lot more powerful. So a couple other things. I won't spend too much more time at this. But let's say, here's a good one. If a fighter, let's say it's a fighter facing a thief and a magic user in combat, and he's using a longsword, speed 5, and he rolls 3 on his D6 initiative roll, while the other side rolls a 5, on what segment does he attack? If the magic user is casting a fireball, while the thief is attacking from the side with his dagger, does the fighter swing his sword on segment 2 or segment 5? How can the act of a spellcaster on the opposing side speed up the attack of the fighter? That makes no sense. Also, returning to what we saw in the player's handbook, that states that the side winning initiative acts first. If we use this rule, this crazy rule on page 66, there's going to be a case where you're going to be losing initiative and attacking first anyway, like a lot of the time. So again, it not only that, it contradicts the other rule on page 65 about acting on the opposing side's the losing initiative segment. It messes that whole thing up. Now, the last thing I'm going to say about this, right, is if we're going to use weapon speed, right, and weapon speed is, I mean, yeah, it's kind of optional, but it's in the rules in Dungeons and Dragons. If you were going to use weapon speed, it makes no sense for the PCs to act only upon the segment as indicated by the D6 initiative roll of the losing side if you're using weapon speed. Example, I'm using a greatsword, speed 10, but the losing initiative side rolled a 2 and I rolled a 5. Oh, so I get to swing the greatsword now on segment 2? That doesn't make any sense. So the implied rule is, and this is from the previous episode that I did, is that you add the weapon speed to the initiative segment. So in this case, let's say it's a long sword. I'm acting on initiative segment 2. My sword would be swung on initiative segment 7. 2 plus 5. And let's say the magic user is casting a fireball and he is going on segment 3. 3 plus 3 equals 6. He gets a fireball off first. So this tends to work mathematically. And I did some simulations where I used different rules and stuff. And it seemed to kind of calm down the mechanics. And it worked. It didn't mean the spellcaster always got to go first. Certainly not. He could still get hit. But it removed this effect where, melee combatants were always winning initiative and getting attacks in on spellcasters if they got within range. So that is how basically, initiative wins or initiative works. And once you get it, you see the bad guys in front of you, you're ready to. You just have to determine on what initiative segment you actually act within the context of the combat round in order to figure all this out, and in terms of when spells go off and when they take effect. And the very last thing I'll add is I've always played it this way. I haven't seen it in any other way in the book, that if a weapon, like let's say I'm looking here, there's some which have like a speed of 12 or something. I think it's like the owl pike or something. If it's speed 12, it just goes at the end of the round. Right? It does not go into round 2 because that would be totally nuts. Now, I don't know how Gary played that, but again, if you're using a weapon like that, you're pretty much always going to be going at the end of the round no matter what, just because of the size, the bulkiness, and the difficulty in wielding that particular weapon. So that's it for today. The only thing I wanted to talk about really was just making sure you're utilizing horses, carriages, wagons, and you're traveling with some degree of realism within the context of the adventure, and just understanding how this AD&D crazy initiative system generally works. And you don't have to play it this way. A lot of people don't, and they don't use weapon speed. They'll use the second edition rules. They'll use the Ostrich rule, right? Ostrich, I don't even think he even uses weapon speed. Or they'll just do something like basic D&D where spells and missiles always go first, right? And then melee happens afterwards. But again, this is what it says in the player's handbook and the DMG. So we will see you pretty soon. I think a couple days we're going to do the episode on the dragons, the Mayfair Games dragon supplements. We're going to talk a lot about that. I'm going to bring back DM Greg for that. And then after that, we're going to have a treat. I think we're going to tackle the FASA Masters of the Universe role-playing game.
Gay!
No, it's going to be good. So,
Just like a woman.
so okay.
By the power of Grayskull.
Okay, guys. Bye-bye. I'll see you next time.